Okay guys, it's time to take a look at loops. So loops are really quite a common thing in languages. And what they do is they allow you to execute a particular statement repeatedly. So here's an example of a loop. You go through, and this is a very classic example by the way, you go through and you create a variable. The variable's name doesn't matter all that much, but it's going to act as a counter, so I'm going to call it int counter. And then you indicate a true or false statement. In this case, I say, is it true that the counter is less than 3? Well, it's 0, so yes, that's true. And when a condition is true, it will go ahead and perform one or more statements. Statements in this case are print out the content of int counter, and a second one is to bump it up by 1, so increase it by 1. Okay, so here's that same code. Let's see if it works. Cool. Now I'm going to go ahead and do a thing called a breakpoint. I'm going to go ahead and click over here in the margin, and I've left clicked. I get a little breakpoint, and with that I can slow down the way it runs by debugging. And when you do this, it will go ahead, start up your code, and then it will pause, at which point you can use these little buttons down here to navigate through the code. Step into allows me to step into the next line of code. I press it once, and I can hover over these variables and see the current value. Currently it's at 0. Step in, and right now the counter is at 0. But once I add 1 to it, it changes. You can also see it down here under variables. And now it's asking the question, is it true that 1 is less than 3? Well, that's still true, so it processes the next couple statements, in which case it bumps it up by 1 again, and now asks the question, is it true that 2 is less than 3? Still true. But when it gets to, is 3 less than 3? That's not true, and so when I hit step into, it just completes running. Now it's going to go over and do some Python code in the background, but we'll just close that. So a while loop just goes through and continues to perform a set of one or more actions as long as the condition is true. Another technique of using the while loop is to get input from the human. Like here, I'm going to go through and say, okay, keep doing something until they type in some kind of, well, they call it a flag. So for example, if I take this code here and I run it, I just click on the margin again, it gets rid of the breakpoint. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and put in some code, and I'll put in some more code, and it just keeps repeating this process. It goes through and says, I get some data, and then check to see if that matches 0. Since it doesn't, it goes ahead and prints it out and then asks the question again. Now as soon as I type in 0, it exits the loop because it is true, or excuse me, it's not true, that 0 is not equal to 0, and so that's enough to make it exit. Now this the flag here can be anything. It could be the word exit. It could be, Q for quit. It could be anything you make up. I just made up 0. The problem with this option here is that I get the input from the human outside the loop to get me started. But then I go ahead and ask them the same question inside the loop so I can keep going. So it's not considered a good practice to have duplicate code. So another way to accomplish this is to break out of the loop using the break command. And I'll do it like this. I'll make it so that it loops continually. And you got to be careful with this because it'll continue to loop until you shut the program down if you don't break out at some point. Then I'll ask the question, what do you want to echo out? What do you want to type out? And I'll check to see if the input is a 0. If it is, I'll break out of the loop. Otherwise, I'll just print the input. And this is better because there's not a repetition of the code. The downside about the repetition of code is that if you ever need to change it, let's say I want to go ahead and I want to say type in a string to print, I need to change it in 2 places. Whereas if I have it only in 1 spot, it's easier to maintain. It still runs the same though. Break allows you to break out of the loop. Continue allows you to restart the loop. So if they've typed in a 0, I can break out. If they typed in a uppercase C in this case, I could continue. And when you continue, it won't go down to the next line of code. It'll just restart the loop. It'll jump back up here. Break and continue are handy to control the flow of your programming logic when you're in a loop like this. Very, very useful. There are a couple other types of loops that are available, but the while loop is probably one of the most common ones in the industry, and certainly it's the one we're going to be using in Module 3. Later on, we'll take a look at some other ones. Hopefully that makes sense. Again, remember that I'm copying and pasting and trying things out. You can do that as well, but in a perfect world, you'd actually type out these statements if you have the time and try them out yourself. You can't program without actually typing, so keep that in mind. Okay, next video is we're going to look at programming arguments, so I will see you there.